In the Old Testament, in Psalms, it says, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path. And in the New Testament, in Timothy, it says that all scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, correction, and training. And I think both of those verses give me a place to start praying, saying, God, show me where you can light my path, where I'm not seeing the pitfalls that are ahead of me. I think of it a lot like parenting. God is the parent and wanting to train us and wanting us to be prepared for what's coming up. As far as like tools, like this year, after reading the Gospel of John that was handed out in church, I went and bought that New Testament. And I think it's just refreshing to read something different. But if I'm studying, I love going to that Bible Gateway and cross-referencing, a whole bunch of different verses, because sometimes that will help have understanding.
And the Bible Gateway is a website, right?
It's a website. I used to think that you had to rise up early in the morning, or it maybe didn't count, but I don't know. I think whenever it fits in, and I do try to fit it in. I like to have a bathtub-worthy Bible because I think that's a great time. I think at the counter in the morning is a good time. In the car, I have bought Bibles on CD just, to have it to listen to. So I think the importance is the doing. You said you ask questions, and I think it's important to ask the questions. You do the 5 W's and an H, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And I think if you start to ask the simple questions like who's talking and who are they talking to, what's the historical setting, that gives you a nice frame of reference to start from. And I think the how is, so how does it apply to my life? Last week you talked a little bit about context, and I remember saying context is king, it rules. And so when I come to the text, from Genesis to Revelation, I look at it as a story of a God who loves us, who created us for relationship. And so I start there.
Did anybody else think that when she was saying that, but when it's time to study the Bible, then I get out the King James Version because it's the only real Bible? No, you don't even get the joke. That's what I thought it was going to be an NASB drop, because there's NASB people out there. But she didn't even sneak that in, and I think she might even be one of those. So, I realized during the news this time how much I lack intelligence, because during the first service, when I was watching the news, when Dan was talking about the pots and the pans and that whole gig, I realized as it came on that speaker was not working, and so I stood up and I walked to the back of the room and I was talking to Lenny. And then, so when I got back up here now, I gave this long dissertation about what the pots and pans thing were all about, and then I was watching that then going like, yeah, another confirmation, I'm a moron. Like, that was all covered the first time. So I got to call Dan and Carolyn after the service and go like, I'm sorry to patronize you and make your announcement for you all over again. I mean, I know I'm a micromanager, but I try not to be. So this morning we're going to finish up this series that we started on Easter called Bibledolatry. So if you're guests with us, I guess just to be fair, like, you're kind of picking us in the 5th episode of the series, so to speak, and we've covered some ground, and I think it's self-contained, but we're finishing something up this morning. And I have to be honest, as much as I've anticipated this series, I've really anticipated it, I've looked forward to it. I think even before we planted a church, there was this desire in me to talk candidly and honestly about the text in this way, and I dreamt since we did plant about, like, man, what would it be if we could be a community, a culture who had this really healthy view of the Bible, and didn't worship it, but at the same time embraced it and used it and recognized the way God uses it. And so it's something that I've looked forward to a very high degree, and yet I have to admit that I'm really excited for it to be over. Largely because this series has been very, very didactic, and I recognize that, and it's been very, I like one point I think mostly because my brain can only remember one point, and I like to take one point and kind of come at it from a million different angles and several different stories and ask lots of questions, and then hopefully that makes sense. I think I talk too fast, so if we just have one point, then it's easier to figure out what that one point is. And so I guess in some ways I'm excited to go back to that and to acknowledge that like the series has been a little bit different than what we're used to within our culture, which is good, and at the same time I'm excited to get back to what our culture is, and I suspect for many of you it's perhaps the same. Like really, okay, Adam, I get it. The Bible's a story. I get that. I get that. Like it's not God. Yep, been clear on that. Like the Bible's not God, but it's a means to listen to God. Yep, I understand that. I understand it has a plot and it has characters and it has a theme. Get all that. Get the icons, cracked icons, like redemptive community, right? Jesus, restoration, all of those different things. And I suspect, maybe I was just being insecure this week, but there's a sense of like, really, like one more week of Bibledolatry, and I suspect that many of you can feel that. And yet what occurred to me this week is that there's one point of tension, I suppose, one field of questions, one string of questions that we really haven't addressed yet. Like we started on Easter weekend with these very bold questions and somewhat troublemaking questions. Like, how do we know when we have to apply it, or how do we know when a command applies to us and when it doesn't? You know, like you take any chapter from any book in the Bible, and inevitably there's going to be commands in there, direct commands, that we're going to say, yep, supposed to do that, and nope, not supposed to do that. And the logic becomes like, how do we know which ones? I mean, maybe you like the word apply. Like, how do we know how to live the Bible, how to apply the Bible today? And these are those questions that I guess, just to admit my error, we asked, but we've never really gotten into like, okay, so how do we? Like, when do we know that Peter's commands in this section apply and they don't in this one? Like, I kind of experienced that this week. I was reading through the book of Acts, and I think because I'm having this fun conversation with a friend about baptism, and at the same time, just a need for narrative, I'm reading through Acts, and I got to chapter 20. And in chapter 20 of the book of Acts, Paul is getting ready to leave this Greek region of the world, and he's surrounded by friends, and he spent a lot of time there, and he says to them, hey, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And everyone seems to understand that his going to Jerusalem is a death wish. Like, you can't do that. You're going to get yourself killed. And he even says, like, I have this sense that the Holy Spirit is calling me to go to Jerusalem, and that what lies ahead for me is persecution and even the implication of martyrdom. And then there's this line where he says, and this is certainly a paraphrase, like, but I don't care, because all I care about is preaching the gospel to people. And I read that, and I don't know if you've ever read the Bible, certainly you've had these experiences. I read that, and instantly there was this like spirit-led conviction, like, whoa, can't relate to that. Or the question that jumped into my heart was like, do I love the world too much? Right? Because like Paul, I mean, it's an implied command, like that we're so passionate about the gospel that we don't, like, we'd be willing to die for it. And yet I'm going like, well, God, am I supposed to obey that? Because, like, I love the trail run. I love my family. I love to watch the Broncos on TV, even though we probably aren't going to get to do that again until, like, 2014 because, like, it's not about money, right? Like, there's lots of stuff about the world, frankly, that I enjoy. And there was this convicting, like, okay, Lord, and it's going to lead to this study for me personally of, like, what does that look like? My point is simply this. How do we know? I'm reading through my Bible, I'm reading through Acts, I'm reading through Galatians, whatever you're reading through, how do I know when this is supposed to be implemented into my life and when it's not? Like, we started the series with what for me were really high hopes, because my dream for us is that we would be a community who are people of the text, people who devour the text, people who understand that, like, this personal time in God, and that's why we've done these videos, to just try to put skin on the many different ways this can look. But people who understand the transforming power of listening to God through the text. That's why we did the series. There wasn't a desire to be radical for radical's sake, but to be practical. And I started by just simply saying, for some of you, like, the Bible has a padlock on it, and try as you might, you just can't open it and get anything out of it. Like, it's snooze fest. You just fall asleep like the 5-year-old at the dinner table, right? And you can read Christian books, and you can listen to Christian podcasts, and you can come to church, and you get lots out of it. But when you try on your own, you can't. And what we said at the beginning was that the hope is that this series would help you to do that. And for others of you, the padlocks aren't inaccessibility so much as maybe intellectual confusion. We said that maybe because of something you watched on the History Channel or what your freshman English teacher said, or maybe you're a person who's knowledgeable in culture and science and all these different things. And one of the things that can happen to Christians is they can hang on to Christ by shelving the Bible because the intellectual tension can become too overwhelming. And what we talked about was like, I think there's a way to navigate this, but it's going to take some time, it's going to take some energy, it's going to take some effort. And so I guess we're going to spend one more week because I feel like I would have failed you if we don't deal with this one more idea, this one more topic, this one more principle, this one more means of understanding how we read the Bible. And yet I have to admit to you that, two things. It's going to be anticlimactic when I tell you the word. It's not like Lenny Palooza or anything like, or like Amalgamate or Caffeinate. It's not that any fun or Bibledolatry, nothing like that. It's a pretty simple, pretty common, pretty bland word, and it's a concept that you're already familiar with, though you might not be able to put your finger on it. And the other thing is it's not like a magic decoder ring. And what I mean by that is even if you agree with this principle, and like when you see that you implement this principle into your life, it's not going to mean that denominationalism goes away. And what I mean is it's not going to mean that there aren't still going to be lots of people who really do love Jesus, who really do interpret the Bible differently. It's not going to mean that suddenly you and your coworker who dramatically disagree about whether or not Christians can have a tattoo or drink a beer or you fill in the blank, right? It's not necessarily going to guarantee that you're going to agree on all those issues. It's just not. I mean, it's quite possible that you and your mom or you and your dad or you and your sister or you and your boss might still disagree on what it looks like to be the church, what it looks like to flesh that out. The technical term there is ecclesiology. Ecclesia refers to community. It's a Greek word, and so ecclesiology is kind of the philosophy of what does it look like to live this out. It's not going to mean that like every church in town suddenly thinks that Helena Ales for Trails was a brilliant idea. It's just not. In fact, what remains is that two people who really love each other and really love God are still going to be able to sit down and read the same Bible and the same text and still have two completely different reads on what goes on there. And it would be easier if God made it simpler than that, and it would be easier if God was more formulaic than that. But I just don't think that he is. It just doesn't seem that he is. But as we talked about in the first week, like we read the Bible with this principle in mind, and oftentimes we don't know it. And what that opens us up to is hypocrisy. Because when someone says, why doesn't your wife cover her head? And yet you think you're supposed to serve people, like what gives? Without the understanding of this principle, you're a hypocrite. And for those of you that are at this place of, you're paused on your spiritual journey, and maybe you're someone who is all about Jesus, but the Bible is just too overwhelming for you, I think it's this principle that can kind of bridge that gap. So we can see it in a few places, and we're going to look at it in a few places before I even talk about the term, because I don't feel like what I have to say is that interesting, so if I tease it, it might make it more interesting. We see it in the Bible itself. Like, we see people in the Bible fleshing this principle out. We see it in the church today. Churches, no matter how quote-unquote conservative or liberal they are, they use this principle. And we see it in the world today when we deal with issues like science and social progress. Let's talk about in the Bible first. To do so, we get to say the word circumcision about 30 times in the next 5 minutes, which is more awkward for me than it is for you, but nonetheless. And I did learn last service, like some people are kind of passionate about whether or not they should circumcise their male children, which I didn't know that was such a divisive issue in our culture. Like I knew the Al-Qaeda was a big deal, and I didn't realize circumcision was such a big deal. So Abram, God calls Abram, and he says, hey, you're going to be my people. And through me, blessing is going to flow for the rest of creation. In fact, the world's going to get put back to rights because of your bloodlines. And we understand that it was Jesus ultimately and the church who came through his bloodlines. And he commands Abraham. And it's not a light thing, it's a heavy thing. He commands Abraham, you mark the fact that your men, that your children are a part of this covenant. You mark it through circumcision, which tells us that it was culturally radical in its day. And so the Jewish people, for thousands of years, have made a very big deal about circumcision. Why? Not because it was their idea, but because God commanded it. In fact, even into the day of Jesus in the Jewish culture, if you were going to convert, if a goyim is the Greek word for Gentiles, if a Gentile, a goy, was going to convert to Judaism, they would mark that via circumcision. You even see in the New Testament, there's this cat named Timothy who loves God, and he has a Greek dad and a Jewish mom, and everybody's kind of all stirred up because he loves God, but he's not circumcised, and there's a sense of like, how can you love God and not be circumcised? It just drives people bonkers. So then Paul is called by God on this road, on this Damascus. He has this crazy experience. And it's as much about, like, God is for the Gentiles too, Paul, as it is God, Jesus is Messiah. And so Paul takes the gospel to these goyim, to these Gentiles. And the Gentiles, they start believing that this Jesus, this person was God, and that his death and resurrection brought restoration to people's hearts, that it made relationship with God possible again. And the question became, do they have to get circumcised? And it was a good question, because people who loved Yahweh all had to get circumcised, or at least the males, right? It was this hanging question, and it became this divisive issue within the early church, to the point where, like, the first, like, church split conference was held in the book of Acts in chapter 15. There's this whole conversation where these big wheels, like James, the brother of Jesus, they're talking about, what are we going to do here? And in the early church, James and Peter, the leaders, they come to this conclusion like, nope, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, which is a violation of a direct command in the text. And so Paul, like you'd think like Paul's pumped, right? Because he gets his way. But he doesn't stop there. He says this in Galatians 5:6, "For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value." Like, hold on, Paul, like, be diplomatic, right? It has no value, he says. The only thing that counts is faith expressing himself through love. So they're like going, hey, the Gentiles don't have to get circumcised. And Paul like takes out the machete and just starts hacking away even further. In fact, in Romans 2, he says this. He says, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. So it's like the church agrees, like, okay, Jewish Christians, yes. Gentile Christians, no. And Paul's like, well, no. Circumcision, it's about the heart. I mean, you can imagine how many friends and allies this made for him, right? Like, you can imagine how mad people were. And then he even goes a step further in Colossians 2:11. Paul says this, in him you were also circumcised. So he's totally trivializing the rite. In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Your sinful nature was put off when you were circumcised by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. He goes even a step further and says, hey, wait a minute. I know God commanded circumcision, but it's been replaced by baptism. A big deal. And the question that I have is, well, what gives him the permission to do that? Like, where does he get off doing that? And you can say, well, he's Paul. He's like St. Paul. He's like an inspired author of the New Testament. To which I would say, cop out. Because he was still a first century person trying to flesh out theology in his day. And somehow he decided that theology was then, but it's not now. You see it in the church in 1 Peter. Don't leave while I read this, because I promise we're going to unpack it. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that any of them do not believe in the word, they may be won over without words by the behaviors of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence for your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. I keep trying to get Teresa to call me Lord, and she just won't comply. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. There's 3 commands in here. 3 commands to women who are living in Asia Minor in the first century, who are themselves Christians and are married to people who aren't Christians. Right? Like, the first command, there's 3. The first one is submit. And we can talk about all that we have in the past. The second one is, like, don't go to the hair salon. In fact, you can't even, like, wear jewelry. And the third one is, it's implied, it's quieter, but you got to call your husband Lord, because that's what Sarah did, and she's a good example. Now, isn't it funny? that even the most, again, quote, conservative of scholars and theologians who are going to say, like, yep, better not go to sugar, better not wear any gold, and, like, he's your Lord. Even they, like, I don't know of a movement that says wives should call their husbands Lord. Like, that's for now. You know of one? Me neither. And you take it a next step. Obviously, there's a whole nother field of Christ followers who love Jesus who conclude, like, well, wait, two of them don't apply to us. Like, we can go to the salon, we can wear jewelry, but we're still supposed to submit in these same ideas, in the same way. And then there's a whole third group of people, I would count myself among them, who go like, wait a minute. That was a first century command to women who live in Asia Minor who were themselves converts and but were married to non-Christian people, and therefore none of those apply to us directly. And so we can say, like, well, I just read the Bible and do what it says. Well, no. So how does the church and how do Christ followers dramatically disagree on which ones apply? How do we navigate that? Or take this one, just as it relates to science and social issues. Like, there's really no jockeying around that the Bible from cover to cover, it assumes a universe that has the earth at the center, that everything revolves around the earth. And yet I suspect that none of us feels like to be an Orthodox believer we have to believe that. The Bible assumes that the earth is flat. And again, that's not an Old Testament idea. Even in the book of Revelation, you have it talking about the four corners of the earth. And in Job, you have him talking about, like, there's these pillars that the earth sits on. So it wasn't just Columbus. It was a Christian idea for a long time that the earth was flat. And yet none of us are dying on that hill. The Bible also talks about a three-layered universe. Right? Like, that there's life that happens under the surface of the earth, and that's where demons and bad stuff and hell, and that's where that happens. And then there's life on the surface of the earth, and then there's life up in the sky, this three-layered universe. And yet, again, I don't know of anybody who seriously thinks that when the Bible says that, like, Hades is under the ground, I don't know that anybody really thinks that anymore. Do you? Again, how do we navigate this, and where do we get the permission to do so? Well, what Paul, what the church, what all of us embrace with science and social progress, we all practice discernment. That's the fact of the matter. Like Scott McKnight puts it this way, the pattern of discernment is simply this. As we read the Bible and locate each item in its place in the story, as we listen to God speak to us in our world through God's ancient word, we discern through God's Spirit and in the context of our community of faith, a pattern of how to live in our world. So Paul discerned, Spirit-led, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it was still nothing more official than discernment. He discerned. That theology was then, but it's not now. With the issues of jewelry and hair and submit and Lord, like, hasn't the church essentially, maybe most practically, discerned that what was going on there was a universal principle, but the fleshing out of that principle isn't universal? Like, what we've embraced is, okay, modesty. God is calling us to modesty. But still, if we're to be honest, it's a discerning issue. Like, we still are using discernment. We're still making the decision, that was then, and this is now. When it comes to science, it seems to me that most of us, what we've discerned is that science and social progress, social justice, it goes a long way in helping us understand what the Bible, or at least what it is saying, what God's truth is. It forces us to confront the fact that what we thought the Bible was saying, right, because Galileo got himself in a lot of trouble to the point that he died a heretic in everyone's estimation. Why? Because he suggested that, like, the earth wasn't the center of the universe. I mean, it's crazy for us to think about, but people died on that hill at one point. Well, what have we done? We've discerned, whoa, the Bible must not have been saying what we thought it was saying. In fact, there's this phrase that I couldn't remember, so I wrote it down, called phenomenological language. What we're saying is that the Bible uses phenomenological language, which means that the language in the Bible is representative of the ancients and it's representative of their beliefs and their thoughts and their feelings. And yet where it gets messy is discerning, but sometimes it's not representative of God's. Let's take the issue of slavery. You don't have to be a very creative theologian to conclude that the Bible promotes slavery. Why? Well, because it's not only it's not just silent on it, like Paul talks about it to the extent that he says things like, slaves, submit to your masters. Well, what is that? It's phenomenological language. It's we've discerned that Paul couldn't even conceive of a world where there wasn't slavery. Just like you can't conceive of a world where there's no internet, he couldn't conceive of a world where slavery wasn't on the table. And therefore, the revealer God was limited by the revealer Paul. We've discerned, whoa, wait a minute. The Bible wasn't saying what we thought that it was saying. Now, I know this is messy. And for many of you, I'm a step ahead of you because I'm with you. Wait a minute. This makes everything relative. This means any yokel can grab their Bible and start interpreting the Bible, and they can make it say anything they want. Yep, they can. And you can create for yourself a religion, and even a supposed Christ-centered religion, where the Spirit never convicts, because you can just explain away every uncomfortable command you want. You can. And you don't need me to give you an example of that happening. It happens in our own individual lives, in our own personal morality, and it happens in whole movements that call themselves Christian. It happens, for sure. That's one option. The other option is what I would call Bibledolatry. Is because the tension is so uncomfortable and so messy, we just pretend that it's not there. It becomes kind of like the Wizard of Oz thing, we know it's there, but we try to convince everybody else that it's not there because it's just easier if our kids don't understand that it's actually messier than this. It's easier if, the common folk don't understand that it's this messy. And so we put up this facade and we pretend all I do is read my Bible and do what it says. And we know that's not true. That's another option, though. Is putting the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak, even possible, though, at this point? The third option, in my view, and this sounds remarkably cliche, but I mean it from every part of my being, the third option is we simply just trust what Christ said. Because what Jesus said was that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. And though we often put it on ourselves to defend his church, that's not what he said. He said the church will be okay, because I'm leading the church. And that doesn't mean we don't have responsibility, and it doesn't mean movements won't get off. But it means that God created a movement that requires discernment, and he leads that movement, and sometimes people refuse to follow, but he'll always find people to follow. Bottom line, from the very beginning, hasn't God been calling people to the text, to listen to him through the text? And in doing, to discern, what does it look like to be God's people in my world today? From the very beginning, from Abraham to Peter to Paul, to 1,000 years ago to today. It's why I cringe when someone says, we're supposed to be the Acts church. No, we're not. That was the first century church. And it looks different to be the church in the 21st century. God has always called people to the text to listen to him and discern, what does it look like to be his people? Now, does that open it up to being really relative? Yeah, and it's why theology done in isolation is dangerous. It's why it's always meant to be done in community. It's why some of the best conversations I had about a book called Love Wins weren't in my own head, but in conversations with people. And my thinking was dramatically steered through that whole thing happening in the context of community. Now, is it going to look different? Of course. Turkish Christians are going to discern differently than our North American Christians. In fact, Christians in Helena are going to discern differently than Christians in Billings. There's this vivid example of this in my heart, and so I'm going to share it. But getting to be a part of the church plant in Billings Harvest, here's some context. At the time, the Billings Heights, it was 25,000 people. Helena was 100,000 people, all a part of the same city. And for all intents and purposes, there was one road into the Heights and one way out. And if you wanted to go to Walmart or Costco, if you wanted to go to Home Depot, if you wanted to go to Lowe's, if you wanted to shop, if you wanted to go to a swimming pool, if you wanted to go to a fireworks celebration, you had to leave the Heights and go to Billings proper. which therefore means that if you didn't live in the Heights, you didn't ever go there because you left there. There was nothing going on there by way of retail or anything like that, or at least very little. In fact, one of the more common stories is that, they didn't have a public swimming pool, and it was on the ballot every other year for like 6 years. But, right, you're a part of 100,000 people. 75,000 of them know they're never going to use the pool, so why would they possibly add that to their mortgage, right? So take Harvest. Harvest was planted with a dramatically different vision than Narrate. Because what happened was Vern, and this is kind of my interpretation of what unfolded, but essentially it was like, well, we'll do it then. Like, Harvest became a hub. It became a purposeful, destination place. And they said, hey, Billings isn't going to give you a pool? We're going to. And they've been working for years on building the money to build a pool for the Heights. Harvest went well, let's do a fireworks display up here so that people don't have to drive from here down to there to go to a fireworks display. And it's now the biggest fireworks display in Billings. They said, hey, every time someone wants to play in league basketball or anything, they've got to go down there. Let's build a building that's a gym so that people can use our venue. It became very relevant. They discerned that what would be brilliant was to build a building that would be a destination. And Helena, I present to you that the exact opposite is true. And what we discerned was that this is a community that's got a ton going on, that it's very proud of itself in a healthy way. There are tons of activities. There's lots of stuff to do. There's lots of facilities that the community utilizes. And so what it does not need is a church to come build a silo and say, come to us. In fact, what we said is what would be really cool is if we could just put a serving towel over our arm and approach the stuff that's already happening and go how can we help? And in fact, we've said, what if we never own a building? Not because buildings are evil or outside of God's or no one should have a building, but because we went well, let's just matter in our community. And we think one of the more relevant ways we can do that is meet in public space. And over the course of the next few decades, invest millions of dollars into public space. It doesn't make us right and them wrong or them right and us wrong. It's that it's going to look different to discern what it means for different communities in different times, and yet that is what God has always done. Called people to discern what does it look like to live a righteous life in my world, in my day. Now, obviously we're not talking about the absolutes, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't any. We're not talking about murder. There's no question on murder. We're not talking about spousal abuse or selling your child into slavery. There's nothing to discern there. The Bible's clear there. We're not talking about the divinity of Christ, that God exists in Trinity. We're not talking about that. What we're saying is it's going to look different. And the most honest way to answer the question, why do you obey that one and not that one, is, it takes some discernment. It takes lots of discernment. And it would be nicer at times, it might feel like it would be better if God invented rules, but he didn't. He left it open to discernment. So we're going to finish up our worship service this way. We have a creed that this community has written. And it's our way of discerning. This is what we think it looks like to be the church. And then we're going to sing a song that kind of goes there's no discernment needed on this issue of who God is. So real quickly before you go, there's this spot I referenced, Acts 20, that as I read it this week, I went I think it's the perfect benediction over us as we leave this series called Bibledolatry. He said to the people, and I just say over you, and now I'm turning you over to God, our marvelous God, whose gracious word can make you into what he wants you to be and give you everything you could possibly need in this community of holy friends. Amen. Have a great week.